today I am talking about adapting to ever-evolving language. All right, so you may have heard in my introduction, my name is Mia Moore. I work at a company called Kamunda. I've also heard it called Kamunda, so you nailed it either way. And one thing about me is that I really like birds. I like birds of all kinds, and I will end up telling you bird facts if we hang out for more than 5 seconds. So if we haven't met before, now we're friends. It's so nice to meet you. So, before we dive into more about inclusive language and my tips and tricks for it, I want to share a little bit more about my personal coming out stories. And if you are queer or you know queer people, you may know that we come out constantly. It's never a one time thing. I thought it was, and then I came out, and it turns out you come out all the time. So I knew from a pretty young age that I wasn't straight, but it took me until I was around 22 to actually feel comfortable enough to come out. I assumed that because I wasn't like fully gay, whatever that means, or because my partner was a cis man, like it just didn't matter that I had this other part of me. But a lot of my friends were queer, much like neurodivergent people, like we were just talking about. Queer people also run together in packs. Like we just find each other before we even know we're queer. So I was like feeling a little bit left out of that, right? I felt like, oh, I have this whole community that doesn't know that I belong. And I thought, well, maybe if I just don't tell people that I'm bisexual, it'll just go away. And that just wasn't true. So eventually it kind of felt like for me, this is a lie of omission. I'm not sharing who I really am with people. I'm sick of some people knowing and some people not knowing. So I ended up coming out via Facebook post. And this is that exact Facebook post. I believe this was 2014. I would use completely different language now just because it's very binary. And I've found out since, spoilers for the next slide, that I am non binary. So saying, do you like boys or girls? Yes. Excludes like a large amount of people that I'm attracted to, which is really funny. But I think it's just very of the time that I was like, this is the easiest way for everybody to know that I'm queer and I don't have to worry about who knows and who doesn't. So for a long time after, I was very proudly bisexual, and I was like, yes, I'm a bisexual woman. I'm very confident in that. A few years later, I started learning more about gender, especially with there was some sort of like discourse about is bisexuality inherently transphobic because you are not, it's bi, does that mean two? Does that mean only men and women? And lots of conversations around that. TLDR, it doesn't, your identity is whatever. And plenty of trans people are bisexual. So like it ended up being fine. But the more I learned about gender and the more I interrogated myself on my own views on gender and my own gender for myself, the more I thought about it, the less things really made sense. And I ended up having a lot of gender feelings. And if I wasn't comfortable with my sexuality, I for sure was not comfortable with my gender feelings. I already felt like I was very complicated as a human being, or I was too much for a lot of people. And I thought, okay, I can know this about myself. I can know that I'm not entirely cis, but nobody has to know. Same thing as my sexuality. Nobody has to know. I'll keep it close to my chest. And this can just be a thing I know about myself, but other people don't have to know. During this time, I somewhat subtly changed my pronouns from she, her to she, they in my bios. And not many people seem to notice. Some of my queer friends notice, but not other folks. And then I tried to switch it to they, she, thinking maybe the order mattered. And that mattered a little bit. Like I saw a little more of an uptick of people using they, them for me. But again, not many people seem to notice. So it turns out, similar to my sexuality, I couldn't actually hold it in, and I got really tired of not being seen fully for who I was. At this time, I was being tagged in a lot of like women in tech kind of lists, and it made me feel like awful every time because it just, again, kind of felt like a lie of omission or like people weren't really seeing me for who I was. But I was still going by they, she pronouns until I was being introduced with a bio that I had written, and in the bio, I had used they, them pronouns throughout, but when the speaker said it out loud, they corrected it to she, her. And it made me feel really bad. I don't know if the speaker was just uncomfortable using a singular they. I don't really know what the context was, but I was like, man, I wrote it using they, them on purpose. It feels weird that that was changed, but I also feel like I can't complain or be upset about it because I had told everybody I also use she, her. And that made me realize, like, oh, things have changed. I'm no longer comfortable with that. And I'm not comfortable with being referred to as she, her most of the time. Like, there will always be strangers that will assume that my pronouns are she, her. And that 10% of the time is fine. But people that know me, I want them to use they, them. So just like Marie Kondo says, I packed up my she, her pronouns in a little box and I put them on the shelf. I said, thank you for all you've done for me, but I'm moving on. And now I'm just using they, them. So I wanted to introduce a little bit more about me because my experience with gender and my experience as someone from a couple of historically excluded groups in tech have made me really passionate about inclusive language because I do believe that it matters. So, in this talk, I hope to also teach you why inclusive language matters, give you some examples of more gender inclusive language, give you some guidance for practicing and for what to do when you make a mistake. And I hope by the end of it, you will have confidence in navigating all the ever changing language around these topics. A quick disclaimer. I'm primarily speaking from a gender and LGBTQ plus perspective. So some of the things I'm talking about today do apply to other areas, but be sure to do additional research just to make sure. And also, I live in the United States and I only speak English. So that means my perspective is going to be inherently biased. And no matter, I tried to account for a lot of different things, but I'm just putting that up front just so you know where I'm coming from. So, inclusive language. The definition is language that avoids the use of certain expressions or words that might be considered to exclude particular people or particular groups of people. I also wanted to point out that this includes things like company specific acronyms or jargon or anything like that. It's about making language more accessible to everyone. So, the first reason why inclusive language is important is because language matters. And I think actually a really great example of this is that this conference is all about core skills. I love that it's a core skills conference and not soft skills, because saying soft skills implies like maybe that those skills are less important than other skills or not essential or maybe only for people who are feminine. And obviously, if you're here, I think you understand that these core skills are actually crucial to your career and to your life in general. So just that small change in language, I think makes a huge impact. And that's why it matters in all other aspects as well. The other reason it's beneficial is because it helps your message connect with as many people as possible. So, from a capitalism perspective, that means you're widening your potential audience, which means more potential dollars. One of the main frustrations I hear from folks is like, why do I have to keep learning new things? I can't keep up with this. It changes all the time. It feels like yesterday I could say this word and now that word has fallen out of favor. And I totally understand it, especially if you're not part of the community in question. It feels like it's changing all the time. But that said, if you're watching this talk, if you're watching this conference, I hope that means that you're someone who enjoys learning new things and growing. I hope that I can show you why this matters and how you can grow your knowledge in a way that is, easy to incorporate into your day to day. And like anything, practice makes improvement. If you put in the effort, it will get easier and easier to remember and easier to do in your day to day life. So, some of the advantages of using inclusive language, it also leads to better communication. So, it's usually more specific and accurate when you use inclusive language. So, for example, saying hi everyone versus hi guys, if not everyone in a group is a guy. It's more understandable. So again, this is part of avoiding jargon. The tech example that I think works really well for this is something that used to be called a whitelist or a blacklist is now called an allow list and a block list. And that works really well also for folks who are English is not their native language, because it's more literal, right? It's a lot easier to understand because you don't have to understand the connotation of certain words, just the dictionary definition. It can be more relevant to your audience because it can help them feel seen. It's also just more respectful, and all of that leads to better communication. Let's talk a little bit about the cost of exclusion. So I want to point out that these are the numbers for LGBTQ plus workers, and I'm sure the stats are similar for other historically excluded groups or people who have multiple different intersecting identities, but these are the numbers I'm going to focus on for today. So 46% of LGBTQ plus workers are closeted at work. That means they are not out as queer at work. 31% of LGBTQ plus workers felt unhappy or depressed at work, and 25% feel distracted from work. The main reasons folks are not out at work is because they have a fear of stereotypes. They do not want to be stereotyped, and they don't want to make their coworkers uncomfortable. As a result, 28% report lying about their personal life, which makes sense. I mean, if someone asks how your weekend is and you have to hide who your partner is or how your family is structured, that gets really uncomfortable really fast. And 1 in 5 report avoiding events like happy hour, lunch, holiday parties, that sort of thing. And 1 in 5 also report staying home from work because of the lack of acceptance. So it makes a really big impact on queer employees. LGBTQ plus employees don't feel like they can bring their full self to work. They feel unseen or not valued for who they are. It can be a distraction from doing work or being more involved at the workplace. It can lead to social isolation. And sometimes people even leave the company they're at because they don't feel included. From an employer perspective, if you don't have LGBTQ plus employees, you lose this very important and diverse perspective. It can result in reduced productivity and job satisfaction, and it means that you cannot retain or attract LGBTQ plus talent. Okay, so we've talked about the importance. Let's actually dive into some of the examples. So we'll be going through these points one by one, but if you were going to take a screenshot, this is the slide I would recommend because this is sort of my gender inclusive language cheat sheet. We're going to go through avoiding unnecessarily gendered language, avoiding assumptions, remembering pronoun etiquette, reconsidering titles and honorifics, mirroring your coworkers, and continuing to learn. So first, we want to avoid unnecessarily gendered language. So masculine terms, at least in English, are often seen as neutral or the default, but they're not neutral or default. So for example, again, the word guys, a lot of people will argue, oh, I'm using it in a gender neutral way, but it makes some people uncomfortable that don't identify as a guy. I actually had a boss who would say to our all male except me team, hey guys, and Mia. And I always thought that was really funny because it was like, oh yeah, I remembered that that word doesn't apply to everybody in the group, but I don't know what to call you, so you're Mia. Which I don't know, it's very cute. So the way to get around this is to think about, is it necessary at all to have gendered language in this context? If it's not, can you remove the reference to gender altogether? If it is necessary, do you know how that person or everyone in that group identifies? And if you are specific about your audience, that can help you figure out what word to use instead. So for example, colleagues is more gender neutral and more specific than either saying ladies and gentlemen or guys. APA's bias-free language guide describes this as describing things at the appropriate level of specificity, which I think is very important. You don't want to overspecify, you don't want to underspecify, use the best word for the situation. So a couple of practical examples. I find in the workplace, a lot of the unnecessary gendering comes from greetings. So for example, saying, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You could just take out the words entirely. You could just say good evening or welcome. But if you want to use some words instead, you can try distinguished guests, esteemed guests, everyone, colleagues. If you say guys a lot or guys and gals or ladies, try friends, or a fun one is friends and enemies, team, people, folks, y'all, all, fam, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. If you're someone who says dude a lot, and you want to start getting rid of that, then dude, man, bro, all those can either just be omitted entirely, or you can say friend, buddy, pal, things like that. There's a lot of examples for these ones, so be sure to Google because, again, a lot of really fun ones are out there. All right, my second tip is to avoid assumptions. So this actually relates back to the last point of assuming that male or masculine terms are the default. That's definitely not the only thing that we have biases around. So when you're talking to an individual, try to assume making assumptions with family structure. Like, for example, saying, oh, what did you do on Mother's Day? Or which assumes that they had a mother or that they're close with their mother. Or saying, oh, do you have a girlfriend? You know, you could say something more neutral just in case their partner doesn't identify as a girlfriend. You want to avoid assuming pronouns and gender identity. This happens to me a lot because I'm a very feminine person and people assume my gender identity based on the way I look. So always ask, don't assume. And you can also use more inclusive language around common workplace terms like parental leave instead of maternity or paternity leave. When it comes to customer personas, this is another area that I think we can be really careful because we want to avoid just reinforcing stereotypes through customer personas. So when it's possible, use real customer feedback and data to build a persona and create more than one persona so that you can target subgroups and not have a single generic persona. If you work for a software company, for example, and you create customer personas that are all male because you feel like you have a mainly male audience, you may accidentally end up creating a user experience that excludes women and non-binary people. And I think we all want to widen our audience, right? We don't want to narrow it down. So a couple of examples, especially around like familial words. So instead of maternity or paternity leave, you can say parental leave, family leave, mother and father, at least in this context. You could try birthing or non-birthing parent. Instead of husband, wife, girlfriend, boyfriend, say spouse or partner or significant other or many, many other examples. I have a friend who's non-binary and a wife, and so they are introduced as knife. Like, hello, ladies and, or not ladies and gentlemen. That's one of the examples I just said, sorry. Hello, everyone. This is my knife. We want to avoid mom slash dad, daughter, son, sister, brother, niece, nephew, and use neutral versions of these like parent, child, sibling, nibbling, family member, or loved ones. And instead of sexual preference, because it's not a preference, we want to say sexual orientation or romantic orientation. Another one that I don't see quite as often anymore, but is still relevant to mention, is gendered occupational titles. So, for example, if you're listing something, a job posting for a sales representative, you want to use a neutral term instead of saying salesman, saleswoman, because that can make people feel like, oh, I can't apply to this because that doesn't apply to me. And more commonly, I see this is specifying gender when it's not relevant. So, especially if you are in tech and you are an underrepresented gender, you might end up being in a lot of women in tech lists or things like that. So, for example, instead of saying female doctor and male nurse, if it's not relevant to whatever it is you're talking about, just say doctor or nurse. Okay, pronouns. So this is a big topic. I could actually do an entire talk on just pronouns. I have done a talk on how to use they, them pronouns. It's a huge topic. So today I'll just cover some basic etiquette. Gender in general is really expansive. So one of the biggest tips here is to avoid assumptions. So again, a lot of people assume that I would use she, her pronouns, but I actually use they, them pronouns. So a couple of tips. First, you want to include voluntary options for sharing pronouns. And I say voluntary because it's not always safe for people to out themselves as trans. So you don't always want to make it necessary. But if you can create an environment where it's clear that pronouns will be respected and affirmed, that's the best thing you can do. So during introductions, like you could say, hello, my name is Mia. I use they, them pronouns. And that makes it clear that this is an environment that respects pronouns. Digitally, you can include it in your email signature, in the employee database, in Slack and Teams and Zoom. A lot of these digital tools have places for pronouns. And physically, if you are in person, you can include it on your name tag or badges at events, maybe have little stickers or enamel pins, lots of different options here. If you don't know someone's pronouns, look it up. All the things above, especially digital. I will look on someone's Twitter bio a lot to see what pronouns they use. You can use they, them. And if you are talking with them directly, ask them what pronouns they use. You also want to make sure that in theoretical examples, you're using they, them as your default, or when someone's pronouns are unknown, that you're not gendering them. So, for example, you could say the person in the red shirt instead of the woman or the man in the red shirt. Titles and honorifics. This is another thing where it's very complicated. Titles are really complicated. I was doing research for this and I found even more titles than I knew existed previously. So there's a lot of them, and then they're also mostly not neutral. So, for example, if someone uses Mrs., Miss, or Ms., that can reveal that they either do or do not want to share their marital status and what their marital status is. You can learn someone's a reverend or a doctor or all kinds of things just based on titles. Very few forms include mix, which is MX with a period. That is a neutral version of Mr., Miss, etc. So there's not even a neutral option on most forms. And then that's not even getting into like military, doctor titles. If you're knighted, do you have to put that on paperwork? I have no idea. So it gets really complicated really quickly. The main thing that I would focus on here is this data actually necessary? There are examples where it's legally required to have someone's title. So in that case, do your best to allow open answers or at least include a neutral option. But if it's not necessary, and don't think that formality is a requirement, because most people that I talk to don't really care about titles these days and being addressed by them, I would suggest just omitting titles altogether or making it optional. Okay, so a couple more examples. You want to avoid saying preferred pronouns, just say pronouns. They're not preferred, they're not optional, they just are. Same with identifies as versus is. So saying someone like he is a trans man is way better than he identifies as a trans man, because that can feel like you're undercutting it a little bit. For forms and other things, try to avoid Mr., Mrs., Miss, Ms., do MX, mix, or omit entirely, or make your answers open choice so people can put in their own, or make it optional. And then in generic or hypothetical situations, avoid using he, him as the default, or his slash her, or the S in the parentheses with he after. I don't even know how you say that out loud. Is it like she, he? I have no idea. So the example I have here is a software developer should always check his or her work for bugs. You can just change that to software developers should always check their work for bugs. A lot easier and much more neutral. Okay, mirror your coworkers. So a lot of the things I've talked about so far work really well in group situations where you don't know how people identify. But in one-on-one situations, what you want to do is be an active listener. So what words do they use to describe themselves? For example, I have a child, and not all non binary people like to be called mom or dad, but I'm fine with the word mom. So if I describe myself as a mom, you can probably use that word to describe me in other contexts as well. You can also ask appropriate questions in appropriate situations. This is a little bit complicated. Maybe Google your specific type of question beforehand, but you have to just use your best judgment on what's appropriate to ask in the workplace, depending on the situation. And then person first versus identity first language. This is kind of another huge topic that could be its own presentation. So I'll give you sort of the 30-second version just so that you can get started with it and you can do further reading if this is something you're interested in or something that's relevant to somebody that you know. So, person first language, the idea is that it centers the individual. So, the example here is person with autism, whereas identity first language centers the identity, so autistic person. But some people prefer person first and some people prefer identity first. So listen to what people that you're talking to say and how they describe themselves, and then use that language as a mirror to them, right? Reflect it back to them. So it really is just individual and depends on the person. The other thing you want to do is avoid using generic language for individuals. So, for example, say she is bisexual or she is a member of the LGBTQ plus community versus she is LGBTQ plus, or he is black versus he is BIPOC or he's a person of color. People usually want to be called their actual identity, not a more generic catch all term. And the last tip I have is to continue learning. Language and its meaning evolves constantly and over time. So when you hear something new, listen and research and approach it with curiosity. A couple of ways that you can learn new things are participating in employee resource group activities. A lot of times they have things that are open to everybody. So I'm part of our LGBT ERG, and we often have workshops and other events that are open to the entire company. You can also join any ERGs that are relevant to you or external organizations as well, and that'll help you keep you in the know. And then if you have something like you're writing copy for a website, or you're trying to build a more inclusive company culture, or you're writing job descriptions to post online, that is when I would consider seeking out professionals that know a lot about inclusion to make sure that you're not using any biased language. All right, practicing and making mistakes. A lot of people are so afraid to make a mistake that they don't even want to try. And I understand that. It is very scary to make a mistake, because you don't want to be seen as like not accepting something or anything like that. The first thing you need to do is understand that humans make mistakes and it's probably going to happen. But that doesn't mean it's not worth trying. The way you handle a mistake says way more about you than the fact that you made a mistake in the first place. So, first off, humans make mistakes. The best thing you can do, if you're able to, is correct yourself in the moment. So, if you accidentally misgender somebody, just correct yourself right after and move on from it. If you feel like you should apologize, definitely do that, but try to do it in a one on one situation. This is something that also depends on the person. But for me personally, if you accidentally use my wrong pronouns in a meeting and you realize it in the moment and you use your correct pronouns, then I would rather you just slack me and say, hey, sorry about that, rather than like call more attention to it. Similarly, you want to avoid over apologizing. So there is a point where you are making the person that you harmed feel bad and like they need to comfort you when you're the one that made the mistake. So avoid that. There's a fine line between not apologizing at all or not feeling sincere in your apology and then just going over the top and making it feel like the other person needs to be like, no, no, it's totally fine. Don't even worry about it. So definitely work on your like apology skills. There is a talk later, I think, about apologizing. So also, this is not an apology saying, sorry, I'm just so bad at remembering this stuff. Not an apology. Feels like you're not trying, feels like you're not going to improve in the future. Practice makes improvement. I have tips for practicing on the next slide, but commit to practicing so you make fewer mistakes. And most importantly of all, don't be defensive. If you are defensive or you offer excuses as to why this is so hard for you, that's not really relevant, right? Just apologize, move on, and improve for next time. All right, how to practice new to you language. I have some more practical tips and then I have some more fun tips on here. The first is to look up examples and resources. So if you meet someone that uses pronouns that you've never heard of before or never used in a sentence the way, like they, them, for a singular person, look up examples. I've even seen resources where they have worksheets you can do, which is pretty cool. Practice in your head and out loud. I've heard stories where people will have a friend that transitions, has a new name, has new pronouns, and they will meet with a mutual friend and practice saying sentences about their friend who transitioned to make sure that they're using their names and pronouns correctly. And I think that's really sweet and, kind of a fun activity. Like get a coffee, make it fun. Slow down when speaking. This one is really hard for me, but I find that I make the most mistakes when my mind is moving faster than my mouth and I'm just talking too quickly. Slow down, you'll make fewer mistakes. Recruit an accountability buddy. So, one thing I like to do is tell people, especially if I catch myself saying something I'm trying to phase out, uh, if I say, like, hey guys, sorry, I'm trying to say guys less. Can you let me know if I say it? That sort of thing. So recruit an accountability buddy, tell your friends, whatever you need to do to keep yourself accountable. Because sometimes we don't even realize that we're saying those words. A guys jar. I saw this idea from Hotjar. I include the link in the resources, so if you want to check that out after, you totally can. But they did a voluntary activity where every time that somebody said guys to refer to a group that wasn't all guys, they donated $1 into the jar and then they donated it all to charity at the end of the experiment. I did a similar version for this in my Twitch chat where if I say guys, I have a command in my chat that people can do to add one to the tally and then I donate money to a charity. So just kind of like a fun way to make it a game and unless you like hopefully that incentivizes you, but it's all for a good cause as well. Give compliments. This is my personal favorite and one that I told some previous coworkers is every time they misgender me, they have to tell me 5 compliments either in their head or out loud using my correct pronouns. So that might be a fun thing to do. Again, just to make it so that you're not stewing and feeling bad about it. And instead you're like giving compliments to this person, either in your head or telling them directly. I think that's pretty fun. And the last thing, and this is like not as quite as easy as a tip, but I really did have to include it, is to rethink gender. So I can tell when someone is repeatedly misgendering me because they don't see me as a non-binary person and they see me as a woman. If you can sit down and interrogate yourself a little bit about what gender means and what being a woman means, what being a man means, all that stuff, if you are able to think through the process of gender a little bit more, I promise you it'll be easier to gender people correctly. So rethink gender, spend a little bit of time on that. All right, that is everything. Thank you so much for paying attention. I really appreciate it. You can find me everywhere as XOMiaMore. I will be posting my slides on Twitter. I also stream on Twitch twice a week, and I would love to see you there. And I'm excited to answer any questions that there are.